Um, so welcome. We'll probably be joined by a few more people because, people start logging on at 7 as opposed to necessarily always being on right at around 7. So we'll maybe have to catch people up. And so we're talking about the disputation of or the disputation at Barcelona, or the book I have in front of me calls it the Barcelona Disputation. Fine, there aren't that many disputations, and this is the big one, so this is the one that most people talk about. Um, and we'll have kind of the historical background and sort of a broad view of what happened or what was said at the disputation, and then a little bit about the after effects. And I think that that will more than take us to 8 o'clock. Um, and so hopefully we'll be able to hit all of the points. And I also give you a couple of pointers to other materials that you can look at that maybe are a little bit more interesting than just reading a one of the few transcripts around that exist of this debate, knowing that transcripts of things in the medieval period are not really transcripts, right? That they're reconstructions from memory, and um, there's all kinds of problems with the material that exists to tell us about this event. And so, that's the agenda is basically what even is this event? What happened? Who was involved? The aftermath, all of those kinds of things. Um, and so we'll just start with what's a disputation, because it seems, well, disputation's a debate, right? But what actually is a disputation? And from the perspective of medieval Jewish history, a disputation is actually a really very specific kind of event. There were not many, 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 many of them. But basically, they are a public debate on the validity of Christianity. And I'm saying that in a particular way. I'm not saying, oh, well, we have somebody representing Judaism, we have somebody representing Christianity. And the idea is, hey, we can let people freely compare. Um, that they are really about proving Christianity valid, and doing that by posing a representative of the Jewish community who sometimes is sort of shanghaied, honestly, into doing it, right? They're kind of compelled. So a representative of the Jewish community who's compelled to debate with a, a representative of the Catholic Church who is specifically chosen for the debate. So in essence, that's the format. It's not a Lincoln Douglas kind of thing. Um, they really reflect some assumptions of how Christianity functioned in the Middle Ages. So you'll note at the bottom I mention the scholastic movement in Catholicism. So for those who for those who really haven't been afflicted with having to read any of the scholastics, essentially scholasticism is a product of the High Middle Ages. So we're talking 11th century to 13th or 14th century, and is a blending of Christian thought and Greek philosophy. And so a lot of the works of the scholastics are either intended to put the two of them together to provide kind of a rational framework for Christianity, or they are organized teachings of the church. So the two names that I've mentioned here at the bottom, Thomas Aquinas and Peter Lombard, many people have heard of Thomas Aquinas. His book, the Summa Theologica, was really sort of the masterwork of scholastic thought in Catholicism. Scholasticism is what gives us canon law ultimately. Peter Lombard is, at the time that this debate is taking place, is really the more important thinker. He wrote a book called the Sententiae, or the Sentences, that is a sort of organized book that was really the textbook for teaching Christianity to Christians at this time. But the way that scholasticism plays into this is Scholasticism works from a Greek philosophical foundation and the idea of reasoned debate and things like that. Um, Scholasticism parallels things happening in the medieval Jewish and medieval Islamic worlds, where Greek philosophy was welded to either Jewish or Muslim thought in an effort to demonstrate the rationality of Judaism or the rationality of Christianity. So, Maimonides is sort of the big example that most people, if they've heard of any of it, Maimonides is the example that you'd find in Judaism as the most widely known example of a comparable phenomenon to scholasticism. Um, there's also Judah Halevi and a few others, but Maimonides is sort of the one that most people know, and that seems to be what the Guide to the Perplexed, Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, it seems to be what he's trying to do. There's debate about the purposes of that work actually, but it seems to be on the at least on the surface level. I'm going to take Aristotle, I'm going to take Judaism, I'm going to put them together. Ta-da! Um, that's what's happening in Christianity at the same time. So it needs to at least look. A disputation needs to at least look like a debate. Whether it actually is a debate, separate question. Um, there are a number of smaller debates, smaller disputations, including some that are friendly, like just rhetoric club kinds of things, all the way into the 1700s. But the big ones are the Disputation of Paris, the Disputation at Barcelona, and the Disputation at Tortosa, which comes, as you can see, another 115, 130 years down the road from the Disputation at Barcelona, in a somewhat different historical setting. Scholasticism has kind of fallen aside for the most part by the time you get to the one at Tortosa, but Paris and Barcelona are of this sort of Greek, quasi-Greek model. Um, there is a made-for-TV movie about the disputation at Barcelona called The Disputation. Um, it is on YouTube in its entirety. It was a BBC Channel 4 production. Christopher Lee plays King James the First of Aragon, and you can see him on the poster there. So the poster doesn't show the Jewish arguer Nahmanides. It shows King James the First of Aragon. Um, and we'll watch a clip from it because the clip does a nicer job of introducing the topics of dispute than the actual documents do. And yeah, anytime you can get Christopher Lee involved, I guess that's a nice thing too. Um, so there are a number of disputations, but really there are three big ones. Um, and I mentioned that sometimes the people who participate in these disputations from the Jewish side are sort of pulled into it involuntarily. So um, the disputations actually organized by King James the First of Aragon, also known as James the Conqueror, right? This is the beginning of a period of time called the Reconquista, where the Christians of Spain are starting to push into the Iberian Peninsula and reconquer, from their perspective, land that Muslim conquerors had taken over. The other person mentioned here, Raymond de Peñafort, you'll see his name spelled a number of different ways. This is the French spelling. There's a Spanish spelling that's probably actually much more like how he would have spelled his own name. Um, Raymond de Peñafort is a Dominican abbot, essentially, who helps organize this and set some of the ground rules. So King James is sort of providing the venue for this debate. Raymond de Peñafort is providing the organization for it and is providing the Christian arguer, this guy named Pablo Cristiani, and the Jewish representative is Rabbi Moses ben Nahman, who's usually or often called Nahmanides if you are talking about him from a Western academic perspective, and the Ramban if you're talking about him from an internal Jewish perspective. I've typed Nahmanides over and over in these slides, and I'm probably going to fall into saying the Ramban just from my own background, I'm talking about the same person. It's Nahmanides. I may say Ramban. It's all the same guy. Um, Nahmanides is much more important ultimately for Judaism than Pablo Christianity is for Christianity, but we'll see that they both kind of have a role. Pablo Christianity is mainly known as a missionary. So his big claim to fame is what we're learning about now, with the exception of he eventually becomes a one of the church's censors of the Talmud after this event. Um, his last name is Christiani because he's Jewish. Right? He was born Jewish and actually grew into adulthood as a Jew, attended a yeshiva, and voluntarily converted to Christianity, joined the Dominican order, left his wife, took the children with him into the church, and adopted the family name Christiani. Right. So this seems maybe a little bit weird, except because would we walk around, hi, my name is Pablo Jew, which is kind of what the last name Christiani means, except that many times when people convert, their Hebrew name becomes Ben or Bat Avraham Vasara, child of Abraham and Sarah. So that's kind of a comparable. I'm adopting into this family line. So same kind of deal with that family name. Um, Largely involved in efforts to ban the Talmud, travels Europe, challenges Jews to debates, goes preaching in towns, um, works as a missionary. That's really his claim to fame up to this point is I used to be a Jew. I understand Jews. I can talk to Jews and defeat them, in essence. Nahmanides is one of the most important rabbis of the 13th century. It's hard to pick one and say that one's the most important, but he would be on the list. Um, Major medieval scholar, so he wrote a work called Wars of the Lord, which is really a legal book that kind of marks him as a more conservative scholar. He gets involved in controversies over Maimonides, who he thinks is way too liberal and off reservation. Um, he also writes a commentary on the Torah that is in more traditional settings when the Torah is studied. Um, you study the Torah on a page that has the Hebrew text of the Torah, the Aramaic text of the Torah, and a number of different commentaries. And Nahmanides is almost always on that page. So he is one of the major kind of lenses through which, in the kind of more traditional way of studying Torah, Nahmanides is one of the lenses through which people read the Torah. And he is known to be involved with Kabbalah, with Jewish mysticism, and his commentary includes teachings that are difficult to understand if you're not familiar with the ideas of Jewish mysticism that he's talking about. And so it can just be confusing to read it if you don't already know what he's saying. But he is important as just a major commentator, and his stuff shows up on the same page as the other big commentators. Rashi's the one that you've probably heard me mention most often. Rashi and Nachmanides are often like on the same line with each other, just one's on the inside of the page, one's on the outside. Sort of depends on the edition. And he does get involved in this. The 13th century is a marked by lots of debates over Maimonides, right? Because Maimonides seems like he's trying to rationalize things and creates a code of Jewish law that has no citations to prior Jewish law and organizes Jewish law, and people really don't like it. And some people think it's great. Nahmanides really didn't like any of it, got himself involved in those disputes. The event that we're looking at is 1263, so we're very close to the end of Nahmanides' life. He's quite aged by this point. He was born in the late 1100s, and he is not enlisted in this thing voluntarily. So this dispute takes place in Barcelona. That is not where Nahmanides lives at the time. He lives in Girona, which is also in Spain. And he just kind of gets told to show up as the chief representative of the Jews of Spain at the time, and so he does. Um, he's given some guarantees for his safety and other things like that, but he's not really doing this voluntarily. It's not like somebody said, "Hey, there's going to be a big debate. Who's going to do it?" Or it's not like anyone asked him. He got a letter from King James the First saying, "You need to be in Barcelona now. Thank you. Come along." Also in the background is something called the Fourth Lateran Council. Jews don't have church councils, so this is not necessarily something that's familiar to everybody. You've heard of the Vatican Council, right? The Second Vatican II, or it's the Second Vatican Council. Church councils are large assemblies of bishops to define church doctrine, practices, teachings, etc., that are going to be mandatory. So church councils can say things like, we're going to grant the Pope infallibility on certain kinds of teachings, right? We hear people talk about the Pope being infallible in Catholic doctrine. Not everything the Pope says is infallible. It only applies to certain kinds of things. That's the product of a church council. Different creeds. Um, Judaism, in theory, doesn't do creeds, except we do. That's if you've heard of Don Olam or Yigdal or any of these other more traditional things that show up toward the end of services, they're creeds, essentially. But in the Catholic Church, creeds are central. They are a big part of regular worship, and there are only certain creeds that are acceptable, and church councils have defined those. There are actually four Lateran councils. The fourth is the one that we're concerned about. Most of the councils are named for where they happened. So there's a Council of Nicaea that happened in Nicaea, which is in Asia Minor in the 300s. The Fourth Lateran Council is 1215. Took place in the Lateran Palace, which is an administrative center for the church today. It is not used as a public building overly much. It has some archives and a small museum. Um, the Fourth Council sets forth various rules, and you can see it lists things like penalizing Jews for usury. Um, it's interesting to read that particular part of the council's decisions because it's sort of Jews are bankrupting Christians, whole countries, take it back. Requiring Jews to dress differently, something that goes basically unenforced for a while. Um, and other things that kind of set the groundwork for the Inquisition, right? So they talk about Jews who convert to Christianity need to totally abandon any Jewish practices, right? That's actually where the Inquisition starts from, the Spanish Inquisition. That's where it really is starting from, is these Jews become Christians and we don't trust them to not do Jewish things. So the Fourth Lateran Council, not everything gets enforced, not everything gets enforced right away. When things do become enforced, they are the basis for how the Inquisition is going to come to function. So it's good to know that it's in the background, but it's also good to know it's in the background um, as the Lateran Council kind of marks the church really taking up the work of persecuting Jews in a centralized and formal way, which it really hasn't done to this point. And you know it hasn't done it to this point because the expulsions of Jews from Spain and from Paris and from Britain come after the Lateran Council, not before. So before we move on, because I know we're moving into the Reconquista, just to note that by the early 1200s, Christianity is starting to expand back into the Iberian Peninsula from north to south. After really, it's about 500 years of Muslim domination of the Iberian Peninsula. So this is Portugal doesn't exist yet. Spain doesn't really exist yet. You have these little individual kingdoms like Aragon, um, Castile, right? These places exist. Christians are starting to push Muslims out. They haven't finished the job yet, but they're making progress. And by the time we get to the early 1200s, what's left of the Islamic kingdoms that were in control in the Iberian Peninsula have been persecuting Jews and Christians quite harshly. We talk about this idea that sometimes Jews in the Muslim world are well treated. By this time, Jews in this part of the Muslim world are not being well treated, neither are Christians. And this marks Christianity pushing back into Spain, but it also marks Christianity starting to really centrally treat Jews poorly. Um, we know that there are prior persecutions of Jews during the Crusades and things like that, but the violence is spotty. This is coordinated stuff by the time we get to the Reconquista. Um, so by the time we get to Nahmanides, we're seeing the church get very centrally involved in persecuting Jews in Christian lands. Okay, so now that I know is the end of that kind of background section. So before we move on to the actual what's this event about, are there questions? And you can just use your virtual hand or however you put up a virtual hand to get grab my attention.
Uh, Jeremy,
Yeah,
was the Crusades were still going on at this time. Is that correct?
there are still crusades going on, and one of the things that shows up in the Fourth Lateran Council's decrees is, hey, we'd like to renew the effort to retake Jerusalem. It doesn't really happen. Um, what is happening at this point in time is that there are Muslims are starting to move across through parts of Turkey, modern day Turkey, um, and the Crusaders really never gain a foothold and retake the land of Israel again. They're trying to. They're trying to kind of start up crusades, right? This is a little bit after the era of Saladin. So there are still crusades happening, but they are not nearly as well organized, funded, or focused. Um, because by this time, the various powers within Europe are having a good time fighting each other too. Um, the Holy Roman Empire is sort of expanding eastward, and they're not so focused
Well, I
on.
asked the question because I'm wondering if this in some way impelled the this uh, Lateran Council to act the way it did to uh, declare this that this should happen. Um, and it was also a time that the church was going after the Catars or the Albigensians. So, do you think that atmosphere is what helped to create this, or is there any relationship like that?
So I think where you're going to see this atmosphere happening for Jews and connection to all of this is less we need to renew the Crusades and also we need to get rid of all of these Jews, and more we need to renew the Crusades. There are Christian monarchs who owe Jews money. We're going to punish Jews for usury, and we're going to encourage Christian rulers to take their money back. Um,
Yeah,
with the idea being that they can then fund all of these other things, right? The Crusades against the Albigensians, the work against the Albigensians. There's a number of different little heresies that creep up all the time in Christianity. Albigensians are one of them. The Tatars in the East are another one of them. Um, so I think that's really there's a financial factor to it more than there is a let's get Jews out of Arab lands or out of our own lands. They're not actually all that interested in getting them out
yeah,
quite yet.
yeah. Thank you.
Yep, we're getting to that point, but we're not there yet. Other questions? Okay, so let's talk about the disputation itself. There are really two main versions of this story that we have that are roughly contemporary. One of them is really like a 3-page document written in Latin by the church as a kind of official summary of this is what happened. The other is a much longer Hebrew account written by Nahmanides that is published later. And we'll understand why it's published later once we kind of come around to that. But I kind of wanted to set up. I'm going to stop sharing and reshare because I didn't share correctly for computer audio. This particular scene in the movie, and it's about 4 minutes long, sets up the terms of the argument, I think, and lets you kind of at least put a face to each of these people that I'm talking about, even though historically we don't really know what these folks looked like. We definitely don't know what Nahmanides looked like. Jews didn't do a lot of representative art. So let me reshare this with all the right settings. Okay, here we go.
Your Majesties, Reverend Bishops, Lords, by order of His Christian Majesty King James, we begin today a disputation between Christianity and Judaism. His Majesty's object in holding this disputation is to draw his Jewish subjects to Christ by reason and persuasion. Speaking for Christianity is Brother Pablo Cristiani, and for Judaism, Rabbi Moses ben Nahman.
Rabbi Moses.
Your Majesties, I too believe that reason is alone sufficient to settle these matters. As my first contribution, I should like to suggest certain lines on which the discussion should proceed. I suggest we should devote ourselves to 2 questions, which in my view are the most vital.
What are they, Rabbi Moses?
The first question is the Messiah come, or is he yet to come? The second question, is the Messiah prophesied in scriptures a man or a divine being?
You agree with this proposal, Brother Pablo?
I do, Your Majesty.
I'm astonished that we have reached agreement on procedure so rapidly.
There is one point I wish to raise, Your Majesty.
Yes?
Rabbi Moses has referred to prophecy in Scripture, but not to the Talmud. If I may explain, the Talmud is the book of Jewish traditions which date to a time long before the birth of Christ. It explains the laws and stories and prophecies of the Old Testament in such a thoroughgoing way that the Jewish faith without it would be shorn of a great deal of its content. It is my contention that the Talmud also proves that the divine Messiah has come.
Rabbi Moses, do you agree that the Talmud should be brought into this discussion?
I have no objection, Your Majesty. However, I should like to give Brother Pablo a friendly warning, which may save him a great deal of time and trouble. It is simply that we Jews do not always agree with everything we find in the Talmud.
But do you not accept that the Talmud is a holy book to the Jews?
I do, but the Talmud is a record of discussions. These discussions took place between rabbis over the course of about 500 years on every aspect of Jewish religion. Obviously, when 2 rabbis disagree, which happens on every page of the Talmud, both cannot be accepted as right. Consequently, many sayings in the Talmud are not accepted by the Jews.
I see.
Moreover, Your Majesty, there is another point to be considered.
Yes.
It is only the legal parts of the Talmud, the halakha, that Jews consider binding. The non-legal parts, the Haggadah, being poetical and open to various interpretations, are not considered binding. The subject of the Messiah belongs to the poetical part of the Talmud.
This is a very strange holy book.
The Talmud is a holy book, but not what Christians mean by a holy book.
But what about the Bible? Do you not accept that the Bible is a holy book? More so, even, than the Talmud?
Yes, but then we are seldom sure what the Bible means. That is what the discussions in the Talmud are all about.
It seems that you are going to be rather difficult to pin down in this discussion, Rabbi. Brother Pablo, can you elicit from the Rabbi a clearer statement?
I shall do my best, Your Majesty.
Now, Rabbi Moses, I think you have been exaggerating the flexibility of the Jewish religious attitude a little. I was a Jew myself for many years, and your description of Judaism doesn't quite tally with my recollection of it.
Perhaps you have forgotten something since you became a Christian.
I don't think so.
Or perhaps there were certain things about Judaism that you never understood.
Tell me, is there such a thing as heresy in Jewish religion?
Yes, there is.
And what is a heretic in Jewish law?
A Jew who denies an essential principle of the Jewish faith.
And what are the essential principles of the Jewish faith?
That is a matter of dispute.
Surely there are some articles of a faith beyond dispute?
There are some, yes. The unity of God is one, the revelation on Mount Sinai another, but we have no agreed and definitive set of theological doctrines as you Christians have, for which you are prepared to burn people as heretics.
Is it not true, Rabbi Moses, that you Jews give great respect to the recorded sayings of the rabbis, even though they may not necessarily be fully authoritative?
That is so.
If you found that many sayings of the rabbis point to the conclusion that the Messiah has already come and that he is divine, would this fact impress you?
It certainly would.
I propose to prove that many sayings in the Talmud show unmistakably both that the Messiah has already come and that his nature is divine.
If you can prove that, you will have struck a great blow for your side of this disputation.
Okay, it was kind of a lengthy video, but what did you get from it as what they were trying to do? Other than maybe paychecks for the actors. So the purpose of the debate was not, hey, we're going to give everybody an equal shot. The purpose of the debate is to convince these Jews by reason and persuasion that Christianity is right, that the Messiah has come, and that Jews have been wrong in remaining Jewish. What are they going to use other than reason and persuasion? What are the sources that they're going to draw on?
The Bible and the Talmud, right?
Right. So they're going to use the Bible and they're going to use the Talmud. And they then have to explain for this 1986 British audience what the Talmud is. And ultimately, there's a problem with the Talmud, which is,
Yeah, well, if the rabbis are always disputing each other, then what is the truth? What do you know? What can you know?
yeah. So somehow Pablo Cristiani claims he's going to be able to prove from the Talmud that the Messiah has come and that Jesus is the Messiah. And when he says that, Nahmanides says, well, like, wait a second, though. How are you going to do that? Because there are multiple voices, and the literature that you would be citing is not the literature that we think is actually binding. It's persuasive, it's authoritative, but it's not exactly it's not a holy book in the way that Christianity understands holy books to be. And so, Pablo, you've misunderstood how this literature works.
But he also made, I think he made a mistake in his statement, or one of them did, saying that the Talmud predates Jesus.
Right. So that's a that's both a problem and not, which is to say, the Talmud as a document is 500 years, comes 500 years after, and there's another part of the video where that's mentioned. Um, However, from the rabbi's perspective, from Nahmanides' perspective anyway, um, there are statements from rabbis who predate Jesus. And those statements, those rabbi statements in the Talmud are what he's probably really thinking of. Um, or should I say, those statements are what the screenwriter is thinking of. Um, I think you'd have to admit that this is sort of an odd thing to put on a TV movie. It would definitely not play in the US. Um, the writer for this particular movie, the screenwriter, is a dramatist and scholar, might be stretching it a little bit, named Chaim Maccoby. And Chaim Maccoby is the scholarship that a lot of the scholarly work that he did was about the historical Jesus, which uh, I don't know. We'll maybe sometime at a happy hour, I'll tell you what's wrong with the pursuit of the historical Jesus stuff. But he was involved with that, and he wrote this as a interesting way of talking about anti-Semitism and medieval history. Um, and it got turned into this movie. The movie really sort of is not so much is not as faithful to the literal text of the debates that we have as much as it is sort of doing a good summary for modern viewers and really focuses on the personalities. And in particular, he's interested in the relationship between Nahmanides and James the First. So it's not a perfect reproduction, but this is it's much easier to do 4 minutes of this, which lays out a whole bunch of these things, than it is to grab a paragraph from here and a paragraph from there in Nahmanides' account, and really only Nahmanides' account, to kind of get a feel for what the goal is and what materials they would have been talking about. So that's really what's going on here. The the priest who kind of started everything off, explaining the purpose of the debate, was the role of Raymond de Peñafort. Um, the woman who was sitting next to Christopher Lee's King James the First is um, this is a complicated thing to explain. So it's King James the First's third wife, whom he married in secret, who was never actually a queen, and whom he claimed had leprosy and eventually kind of shut away in a tower, essentially, in order to pursue an incestuous relationship with another relative. So James the First was very long-lived. He lived a really long time, and this is his last wife, but she was not a queen. But somehow she's next to him and given equal footing in the video. Um, Pablo Cristiani is the guy with the the tonsure haircut. What happened here? Okay. Um, so this is from Nahmanides' account of what's going on, and he says,
Oh, can you make it bigger?
"You've spoken well. Now we've agreed to open with the matter of whether the Messiah has already come or if he will come in the future. After that, we'll discuss the question of whether the Messiah is substantially divine or fully human, and after that, we will address the question of whether the Jews or the Christians observe the true law." What did that all mean? And this is Nahmanides. This is the Ramban's preservation of the debate, and we'll talk about what's quirky about what he did a little bit later. But what's really at stake here?
Well, if uh, Nahman, Nahmanides proves his points, he has disproved Christianity.
Right.
It's not, yeah, it's
If
not
he
clear that if it goes the other way, that he has proved that they've proven that Jews should become Christians, however.
so so that's an interesting question. If Nachmanides is proved wrong, does that prove that they should all become Christians? Um, Lurking in the background here, and it's not really expressed clearly in the materials from the Fourth Lateran Council, so there wasn't an easy text to point you to, is the sort of long-running Christian conviction that's at play, which is that Jews actually knew that Jesus was the Messiah the whole time. And they were willfully ignoring that. And that's something that starts with things that are in the New Testament. So it's not only that it's not just that what's at stake is not just, oh, Jews should convert, but would validate the whole Christian worldview that Jews knew all along and were just willfully in denial. That doesn't come out in part because we're relying on, for all of these details, we're stuck relying on Nachmanides' text because the official Christian version of the text is the official Christian version of the debate is only 3 pages long and basically has a bunch of introductory stuff and then says, we showed Nahmanides was wrong, so then he lied and he did this other thing. And then he lied and he did this other thing. And then we showed him he was wrong and he lied and he did this other thing. And then he lied and then he snuck out in the dead of night and we were not able to finish debating with him. So that's the version of events that they published. So we really don't have very much from the Christian side to tell us what was going on. Everybody on the Christian side has already decided that Jews are lying about all this stuff anyway. Nahmanides isn't going to preserve that material because he doesn't think that anybody was lying. So what's at stake is actually not in these documents or in much else, except that we have material that tells us that there were mass baptismal fonts set up because the Christians were expecting to win and mass convert a bunch of Jews. And in the aftermath of this event, those fonts are all taken down. The noble people all went home after having expected some big spectacle. So it seems like somehow Nahmanides at least did well enough to frustrate Christian observers. But all we can do is take his word for it because the Christians claim that they won and he left in the dark of night and they couldn't find him again. So there is no actual winning the disputation. That's sort of in the background too, is if the local Christian king calls you up and says you have to come here, then you go and you do the best you can and you sort of hope you get off well. And that seems to be what happened here. And James the First seems to have had a little bit of a nonconformist streak to him which probably helped too. So that's the debate, really, is part of what Pablo Christiani is saying when he says, I can prove from the Talmud that the Messiah has already come, that Jesus is the Messiah, is he's proving you Jews knew this all along, which is a big claim and is a central part of Christian anti-Semitism. Right? It's the satanic influence over the Jews. That's part of all of this. Um, if you happen to hear a bunch of thumping in the background, my neighbor's dryer or washer is out of balance, I think. So I kind of apologize in advance if you're picking any of that up. Kathy.
Yeah, you said that the Christian side expected there would be mass conversions after this. So that implies there was an audience. I mean, how did people find out about this? Was it a public spectacle or okay?
It was sort of quasi-public. What ended up happening was a number of Christian nobles were invited to come watch this. Um, we didn't get any of the shots of the room from the movie that kind of let you see that there are other people hanging around, although you might have been able to hear some murmuring in the background. So a number of local nobles were invited to come watch this thing, assuming that they were going to win, and then they seem not to have won. Regular people didn't really witness it, but sort of knew that there would be something big happening because all of this stuff is being built, and people were very confused when it all kind of petered out at the end. And this is really the only one of these disputations that Jews, quote unquote, won, which winning is sort of a questionable title for it because you can't win, but it's close enough, I think, is how we'd put it. So this is the basic set of arguments Christianity is saying, look, the Talmud says Jesus came and is the Messiah and will come again, and the Bible says so too. And Nahmanides says, well, actually, Christianity didn't get anything about the Talmud right and isn't right on the Bible, and Jews' traditional understandings of these ideas are the correct one. And all he's really doing is playing defense, essentially, at this point, right? He's not going to win. He's not going to win over Christians. He's just trying to defend the Jewish community as best he can, and he's been drafted into it, right? He's in his 70s. This is not the thing he wants to be doing in his 70s, I assume. I haven't had any communication with him to confirm that. Mary.
So if the Christians believed the Jews knew that the Messiah had come, what did they propose as the motivation for the Jews not openly recognizing this and converting just because they believed it?
So what's the rationale for what is the rationale for thinking that Jews knew this stuff and
And
denied it
still denied it,
and
yes.
still denied it intentionally?
Yes.
Christianity has a really big fundamental problem, even in its earliest stages, which is they have to explain why Jews didn't follow Jesus to start with.
Right.
And this is in Paul's letters, his particularly the letter to the Romans. It's a little bit in Corinthians, it's a little bit in Galatians, but it's very prominent in Romans. They have to resolve this tension, and they never really succeed. Christian theology does not succeed in resolving this tension, but one of the ways that you can kind of go about doing that is to say, and this is essentially what the Gospel of John in particular says, but the Gospel of Mark kind of does this too, is it essentially says Jews made some kind of as a people, made some kind of deal with satanic forces. And that so they're stuck having to say Jews made some kind of a deal with Satan, But also, Jews are somehow still some version of a chosen people of God, so we're not at liberty to get rid of Jews altogether.
Mhm.
So we can't get rid of these people that we think are in league with Satan, but we can try to convert them and that will save their souls. We're allowed to convert Jews, we're just not allowed to get rid of them altogether. This eventually becomes, well, you can't really get rid of all of the Jews, but if you want to kick them out of your Christian kingdom, you can do that. Leave them to their own devices. So 1,200 years into Christianity, which is where we are now in 1263, they're still having to deal with this problem. And this represents their attempt to deal with it in 1263. And it doesn't hold up logically, but there's a lot about Christianity that doesn't hold up logically. So we shouldn't necessarily expect that, I think. Mary, go ahead.
So is it the Torah or the Talmud that is the source for the Messiah cannot come until all Jews have returned to Jerusalem or the Holy Land or whatever it was called in the day?
Well, it's mostly the Talmud. It's really mostly the Talmud, but um, the Talmud tries to prove it by looking at biblical texts.
Okay, but
And
why wasn't this the argument at this conference that look around, all Jews are not in Jerusalem, therefore the Jews could not believe that the Messiah has come?
that does become a small point of argument that they actually start talking about some of these issues in a little bit more detail. And we'll actually see one of them. I think I have those slides in there where we'll see a little bit of that discussion. Um, it's not huge in there. It's in there a little bit. If you watch the movie actually spends a lot of time on that argument, as it turns out. But it's not quite so expressly well said in Nahmanides material. The movie has it because a modern person was writing it for a modern audience. Um, but it does come up that, you know, these kinds of, well, the world's not okay, so what are you talking about? Right?
But isn't that where we are today? This is why the evangelical Christians are so supportive of Israel and want to make it a home for all Jews to go back
Mhm.
to, so the Messiah can come.
Yep. I mean that was the argument then, it's the argument now. It's the belief set then, it's the belief set now. Um,
And billions have died in the process
right,
over the centuries.
right. And that is one of the parts of the movie that's actually not terribly historically faithful to the documents we have on hand, because that particular argument is not really well documented in the original documents, but it's in the movie. So that's a thing to kind of put a footnote on if you do happen to watch the BBC movie, is some of the arguments are not really all that present. And I will tell you one of the places to actually find the transcript, that not the transcript of the movie, but the primary texts, so that you can actually look at them and see they're written very medievally, so they're written in a very formal way, and they're not smooth reading, I think, is how I would put it. Um, I mentioned this kind of already, that we don't really totally know what happened, because um, we're using two different texts, one of which is very short and has as its job making Nahmanides look bad, and the other one is Nahmanides, who is doing something different. He's trying to preserve arguments for a particular reason. Um, the reason for them writing is very, very, very different. So the Latin document wants to show Nahmanides lost and that he's a liar and to justify forthcoming missionary activities, which we'll talk about. The Hebrew one is actually there. It's sort of obscure. The text of it obscures what Nahmanides thought he was doing. But in essence, what Nahmanides was trying to do was to say, okay, I'm going to preserve here all of these arguments that I made because I won. And so I'm preserving them because I don't expect that people are going to get away with not having to deal with this again. So rather than just go off into the sunset having won, I'm going to tell you what I did. And so he gives an account of the beginning, and then he immediately starts talking about all the various arguments because he's trying to do the rabbi thing, which is provide advice to subsequent community members so that they can do this too, somehow. And you can see how different the ending turns out for each of them. So Nahmanides says, Our Lord the King stood and ascended from the ark of the law, and they left. And the next day I stood before our Lord the King, and he said to me, Return to your city and live there in peace. And he gave me 300 denarii, and I departed from him with great love. Great relationship with King John the First. He gave me 300 pieces. He gave me 300 coins to go home. I won. The official version says he was trying to escape the disputation with lies, right? The whole way through, he's lying. Further, though he'd promised in the presence of the Lord and King and others that he would answer questions on his faith and law to a small gathering, when the king was away, he fled. He's not able to defend his erroneous creed. Right? This is the contrast. This is the last page of the translation of Nahmanides stuff, which starts on page 90 something of this book. This is the last page of the official version, which comes right after Nahmanides. So you can see this is the end, is page 116. It's 3 pages long, and that's it. Oh, I didn't manage to preserve this discussion. There is a discussion of there's a text in Genesis 49 that says the scepter will not pass from Judah. And they have a debate about whether this means that there will be an ongoing kingdom or whether it means that if Jews lose political power, then that proves that the Messiah has come because Jews have no king. So there is an argument, but that's an example of well, the world isn't in great shape, so how can the Messiah have come? It's just not that big of an argument in the materials as it would be to us a big deal as an argument. So it just is a very small, sort of obscure discussion, which is, I think I put it in and then ultimately took it out because it could be very panels. It could be a bunch of panels. Um, some of the aftermath of this. So the beginning, James the First says, I'm going to give complete freedom of speech so that you can say blasphemous things. Because Nahmanides says, look, I can't make these arguments without being blasphemous from your perspective. And we'll see that his protection sort of stretches past the disputation, which is interesting. Um, we don't know who really won, except we know that Nahmanides was somehow successful because he manages to get away, that these mass baptism sites are taken down. We also know that John the First issues an order saying to the Jews of his country, Pablo Cristiani is going to come and preach to you, and you have to listen. And if any other priests come, you don't have to listen to them. You can send them out. You can't make priests, you can't make Jews come to hear him. So they just want Pablo Cristiani to do it. So he did well enough that they felt confident that maybe if he goes and preaches to Jews, he'll convert them. Um, James seems to expel Nahmanides from Spain, but at some point the church sends a letter to James the First saying, um, "Hey, that guy Nahmanides, you need him to come back and burn all of his books because he's publishing an account and we're really unhappy with this. It makes us look bad. You need to stop him." And so James sends a letter to Nahmanides and says, "Hey, you need to come answer for this, but we're only going to make you do that if you show up," which is essentially a letter saying, just don't be here anymore. And no one's going to chase you down for this. Nahmanides is said to have left Spain entirely and gone to Jerusalem. Um, it's not clear that this really happened. There is a letter that supposedly preserves this information, but how genuine the letter is, we don't really know. There is a synagogue in Jerusalem that is called the Nahmanides Synagogue. It is purported to be the synagogue that Nahmanides helps either found or reconstitute when he gets to Jerusalem. Um, there's no way of knowing if that's true. There's a lot of skepticism about it. Whatever that building was doesn't seem to exist anymore, but it's called the Nahmanides Synagogue, and it is one of the oldest synagogues still functioning in Jerusalem at this point in our own time. Pablo Cristiani is not successful with these preaching sessions that he's allowed to do. And so in 1264, he meets with the Pope and denounces the Talmud and manages to be one of 5 censors appointed by James the First to redact the Talmud. So these guys sit down with the Talmud and go through it, and they pick all of these things that they want to pull out, and they censor the Talmud. It's one of the first real organized censoring moments because prior to that, there aren't as many Jews who convert to Christianity and have any ability to work with the Talmud at all. And so these 5 censors start pulling materials out of the Talmud. And if you look at a volume of Talmud today, the page number, there are 2 sets of page numbers. The page number on the front of the page is in Hebrew. The page number on the back of the page is in Arabic numerals. And the Arabic numerals on the back side of the page were what, in this case, in the case of the Talmud as we have it now, Imperial Russian censors used to indicate that they had reviewed this page of Talmud and censored what they wanted to censor. So this begins a multi-century process of Christians reading the Talmud and pulling material out of it and saying, we're not going to let you study this. We're not going to let you study that. And then in the late 1260s, Christianity persuades King Louis IX of France to grant him permission to enforce the Fourth Lateran Council's provisions requiring Jews to wear something different as clothing, and specifically badges, which should sound really familiar. So this is the first widespread national level sort of decree that Jews had to put on a star, essentially, on their clothing. The Star of David wasn't widely used then. It was a different symbol, but this is essentially the first yellow star decree. This is something that Pablo Cristiani does. So this is sort of the tail effect of this debate is Christiani kind of isn't really able to use persuasion to change what Jews do, and so moves on to more forcible measures that can be used against large groups of Jews. We have persecutions of Jews prior to this. It's not like it doesn't happen. We have accounts of them. They tend to be local pogroms more than they do national level discriminatory measures, in part because Europe before this is still sort of fragmented other than the Holy Roman Empire. This is really the banner moment for some of the things that we start to recognize as modern persecution measures against Jews is really sort of Pablo Cristiani's real historical effect because nothing much comes from the disputation at Barcelona. But this is the thing that becomes of the disputation at Barcelona is not really persecution of it's not really mass conversion. It's the start of this other longer process that we kind of recognize today as being the things that really happen to Jews over and over and over and over in history. The pogroms are sort of these limited moments of physical danger. It's the badges and the Jews need to live in different neighborhoods and things like that. That's stuff that starts in earnest right around this period because of the loss at the Disputation of Barcelona. If you are interested in learning more, you can watch the disputation. I'm happy to send the link because I know that I've shown the link a couple of times. The entire video is preserved on YouTube by somebody who teaches history. So he's kind of probably gotten hold of a VHS tape, pulled it into a digital format and stuck it up there, but you can see it has subtitles and all of that too. And then there's this book, which called Debating Truth. It is a graphic novel kind of a format. So much of the text of it, like there's lots of nice pictures and things, but much of the text of it is actually Nahmanides writing. So it doesn't become an easy read, but it has pictures, which is nice. This is written by a professor at University of Florida, a Jewish studies professor at University of Florida. So the language in the bubbles is her language. The art is done by an artist. She is not the illustrator. But half the book is really other material. So you almost want to read the second half of the book first because it has all of the primary sources that they drew on, Nahmanides' version of it, the official letter describing what happened, correspondence between James the First and others. So there's lots of primary the some of the bits of what the Lateran Council would decide that are kind of hovering in the background. But there's a huge, it's I don't know, it's about a 60-page essay on the historical background, including the Reconquista and what was going on with Islamic rulers at the time, and a discussion of the historiography, like how did I reconstruct this, written by the professor. And then there's a bibliography. So this is actually if you're interested in this particular event, this is a really convenient way of getting kind of all the materials. I paid $15 for this. I mean, it was used. You can see it has the used sticker from a college bookstore. But, people use this as a textbook, and it's just called Debating Truth. And Amazon has copies, and I don't know if they've ever made an electronic version of it, but that would be convenient, I suspect, as well. And there's some introductory essays and things like that. So you can